I'm Lieutenant Commander Casey Reyes, and I was 34 the night I almost didn't come back from the water. I woke up in a hospital bed with a chest tube in my side, a collapsed lung reinflating one slow breath at a time, and 61 missed calls lighting up a phone I could barely lift. The first voicemail was my mother's voice, bright and rehearsed, the way she sounds when she's already decided you'll forgive her before you've even heard what she did. Casey, honey, don't be upset. We sold the cabin to cover the venue deposit for your sister's wedding. You were in surgery, so your father signed for you. It's handled. Handled. My grandfather's cabin, the only thing on this earth that had ever belonged to just me, gone while a machine was helping me breathe. The wedding was 17 days away. I couldn't sit up without help. But I made one phone call from that hospital bed, and what happened at that wedding is something neither family in that room will ever forget. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where families find out exactly who they married, who they raised, and who they underestimated, usually all in the same room, usually all at once. If you've ever been told your sacrifice was simply expected because you were the strong one, stay with me, because this story earns that title. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe, because you do not want to miss the 12 people who stood up in that ballroom. Let me back up, because you need to understand who I was before that hospital bed, before any of this. I am a rescue swimmer with the United States Coast Guard. If you don't know what that means, here's the short version. When a fishing vessel is going down in 40-foot swells at 2 in the morning, when a helicopter can't land and a boat can't get close enough, somebody has to jump out of the sky into black water and swim to the people who are drowning. That somebody, for the last 11 years, has often been me. It is, by every metric that matters, one of the most physically demanding, psychologically brutal jobs a person can choose. The training pipeline has a washout rate higher than most special operations selection courses. We drown-proof in pools with our hands and feet bound. We tread water until our bodies fail and then we do it again. We pull people, strangers, sometimes friends, sometimes bodies that didn't make it out of water that wants to kill everyone in it, including us. My family calls it the lifeguard thing. I'm not exaggerating for effect. At my cousin's graduation party 4 years ago, my aunt introduced me to a neighbor as Casey does something with boats. My own mother, when people ask what I do, has a rehearsed little laugh and says, "Oh, she's basically a lifeguard, but for grown-ups." It's very physical. She'll figure out what's next eventually. What's next? As if 11 years of night rescues in open ocean was a gap year. I stopped correcting her around year 3. You learn, in a family like mine, that correcting the story just makes you the difficult one. So I let it stand. I sent money home when the roof needed replacing. I flew back for every holiday I could get leave for. I never once brought up a rescue at the dinner table unless someone asked, and nobody ever asked. I became very good at being small in rooms where I used to think I'd eventually be seen. The cabin is the part you need to understand, because everything else in this story hangs off of it. My grandfather built that cabin with his own hands on 4 acres of lake frontage in the years after he came home from Korea. He taught me to swim off that dock before I could properly walk on land. When he died, he left it to me specifically, not split between the grandchildren, not folded into the estate, just to me, and will his lawyer read out loud in a room full of relatives who did not expect that outcome and did not hide their surprise well. She's the one who actually comes, my grandfather had written in a letter his lawyer also read that day. She's the one who will keep it standing. He was right. I refinished that dock myself over 3 summers of leave. I paid the property taxes on a rescue swimmer's salary without ever once asking my parents for help, the way I'd watched them help my sister with her condo down payment, her car, her wedding venue deposit, without blinking. The cabin wasn't just wood and lake frontage. It was the only inheritance in my life that had ever said, in writing, in my grandfather's own hand, "I see you. I chose you." My sister Devon is getting married this fall to Grant Calloway, and if you know the name Calloway, you know it because it's on the side of about 1/3 of the shipping containers that come through the eastern seaboard. Old family, serious money, the kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself because everyone in the right rooms already knows. My mother has been planning this wedding like a military campaign, which is a comparison she would hate if she knew I was making it. The right venue. The right florist. The right story to tell the Callaways about who we are. I was assigned, as usual, a small supporting role: show up, smile, don't bring up the job, don't make it weird. I was on a rescue mission 2 weeks before the wedding when everything changed. It was a commercial fishing vessel 40 miles offshore, taking on water in a storm system that had turned faster and meaner than the forecast promised. For crew, one already in the water, hypothermic, going under. I was the swimmer on the hoist that night. I got the first man. I got the second. The third one fought me. Panic does that. It turns rescue into a wrestling match with someone who was trying to drown you both, and in the fight, a piece of rigging that had broken loose from the sinking hull caught me across the ribs and drove me under. I don't remember much of the next 90 seconds. My flight mechanic does. He'll tell you, if you ask him, and I try never to ask him, because I've seen what it costs him to answer. I woke up in a hospital with a collapsed lung, 3 broken ribs, and a surgical team that had spent 4 hours making sure I'd breathe on my own again. I'd saved 3 of the 4 that night. The 4th is a story I carry the way you carry every name you couldn't bring home, quietly, on purpose, every single day. I was still in the ICU, still on oxygen, when my phone lit up with the missed calls. 61 of them. And that voicemail. A nurse named Odalise came in to check my vitals and found me staring at the ceiling with the phone still in my hand. She asked if I was in pain. I told her the wrong kind of pain doesn't show up on a scale of 1 to 10. She didn't understand what I meant yet. I barely did either. I am, by training and by temperament, someone who does not fall apart in the first 60 seconds of a crisis. You cannot do my job and be a person who falls apart. So I did what I always do. I assessed. Cabin, sold. Signature, mine, apparently, though I was under anesthesia. Timeline, 2 weeks to a wedding my family had funded with a house I never agreed to sell. Somewhere in that hospital bed, with a chest tube taped to my side, the rescue swimmer in me took over from the daughter in me, and I started building a plan the same way I build a search pattern before I ever hit the water, methodical, unhurried, and built to find exactly what's actually there, not what I'm hoping to find. Odalise, I said, my voice still wrecked from the ventilator, I'm going to need my surgical and ICU records. Every timestamp. She looked at me the way people look at a patient they think might be confused. I understood the look. I wasn't confused. I was already building a case before I fully understood there was one to build. Here's what I need you to understand about how this happened, because it matters more than the dollar amount. 6 months before the wedding, at a Sunday dinner, my father had floated the idea, half-joking, the way these things always start half-joking, that the cabin could be leveraged to help cover the wedding's ballooning costs. I said no. Clearly. Immediately. My grandfather left that cabin to me, I said, and it is not on anyone's ledger but mine. I thought that was the end of it. I have since learned that in my family, no from me has never once functioned as a full sentence. It functions as an opening position in a negotiation nobody told me we were having. After that dinner, 3 things happened that I only pieced together later. First, my mother started referring to the cabin, in conversations I wasn't part of, as Casey's little getaway, a phrase that quietly reframed a 4-acre inherited property into a hobby. Second, my father, who I would learn had co-signed a decade-old emergency power of attorney with me before my first extended deployment overseas, the kind every service member is pushed to set up in case something happens far from home, never had that POA revoked, because I trusted him, and because it had simply never occurred to me that trust needed a paper trail. And third, unbeknownst to me, my father had a business partner, a man named Russ Ferreira, who had been trying to buy lakefront property in that exact area for 2 years and had been quietly, persistently making offers on my cabin through my father, offers I had never once heard about, because my father had never once passed them along. I signed nothing. I authorized nothing. I was under general anesthesia at a naval hospital when a deed transferring my grandfather's cabin to Russ Ferreira was signed, notarized, and filed using a power of attorney I had never revoked because I never imagined I'd need to. They discharged me 5 days later, on a walker, 3 broken ribs strapped and aching with every breath, and I had, for the second time in 2 weeks, nowhere that was fully mine to go home to. My best friend from the Coast Guard, a rescue swimmer named Priya Okafor who I've done 90 hoists with and trust with my actual life on a weekly basis, drove 3 hours to get me and set me up in a short-term rental near the base. She put my meds in a labeled pill organizer, made me eat actual food instead of protein bars, and sat across from me while I pulled out a notebook, because when everything in my life is chaos, I make a list and I work the list. It's the same instinct that keeps a swimmer alive in a search pattern. Don't panic, don't guess, cover the grid methodically. Page 1, dates. The mission date. The surgery date. The date of the voicemail. I left space for the dates I didn't have yet. Who are you calling first? Priya asked. Your mom? I shook my head. The first call was not to my family. It was to a real estate and elder law attorney named Marcus Kwan, recommended by a JAG officer I'd worked with years earlier. I described what had happened in the same flat, sequential voice I used to brief a rescue: patient stable, property transferred, authorization status unclear. Kwan asked me 3 questions, in order. Was there ever a power of attorney naming your father? Yes, an old emergency one. Had I revoked it? No, and here was the problem, because unlike some people in a similar position, I hadn't thought to. And who was the buyer on the new deed? I didn't know yet. Kwan told me something I wrote down word for word: if that power of attorney is still technically valid, this is going to be a much harder fight than if it had been revoked. Get me every document filed. Don't tip your hand to your family. Just listen, and write down exactly what they say. I hung up and understood, for the first time, that I did not have the clean legal weapon I'd assumed I had. This was not going to be as simple as proving a forgery. This was going to require finding every crack in a transaction my own father had engineered while I was unconscious under a legally standing authorization. It would take real work. I have never once minded real work. My parents came to the rental 2 days later, because of course they did. My mother arrived first, with a grocery store bouquet and a face already arranged into wounded concern. My father hung back near the door, hands in his pockets, doing the quiet, reasonable man act I would come to recognize as his default setting whenever accountability entered a room. We were worried sick, my mother said. You called 61 times after the surgery, I said. Not before. She set the flowers down and started talking fast, the way she does when she's rehearsed the speech in the car. The venue needed a deposit. The market for lakefront property was strong right now. They didn't want to stress me in my condition. And then, inevitably, the line I will hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. Honey, it's just a cabin. Your sister only gets married once. I looked at this woman who had spent 3 summers watching me refinish the dock board by board, who had eaten fish I caught off that same water, who now called it just a cabin because it had become inconvenient to her plans. My father finally spoke. You've always been the strong one, Casey. We knew you'd understand. Devon needed this. You don't. I didn't raise my voice. In 11 years of pulling people out of the ocean, I've learned that the calmest voice in the room is the one that survives the debrief intact. Who arranged the sale? I asked. The silence that followed told me everything before my father finally said it. Russ handled the details. Russ. My father's business partner. I wrote the name down and drew a box around it the second they left. Before they walked out, my mother delivered the part clearly meant to trap me, dressed as concern. Deposits were already down. The invitations were printed. The Callaways were expecting a certain kind of wedding, and if I did anything rash, I would be the one who ruined it, 3 weeks out, in front of a family whose name was on shipping containers up and down the coast. There it was, the deadline as a weapon. They believed the clock was on their side, that I would never detonate a wedding already in motion, that I would absorb the loss of my grandfather's cabin the way I had absorbed everything else, quietly, so the peace could hold. For one tired, aching minute, on painkillers, with 3 cracked ribs, I almost believed their math too. Then the swimmer in me did what she always does in bad water. I stopped reacting to the current and started reading it. A deadline is not a feeling. It's a number on a timeline, and reading timelines under pressure is the actual job I have done, successfully, at 2 a.m, in water that wanted me dead. 17 days wasn't their advantage. It was my search window. Kwan worked fast. Within 4 days he'd pulled the recorded deed and the closing file from the title company. Priya held the laptop steady while I read it, because sitting up too long still made my ribs scream. The buyer's name was printed in plain black letters, Russ Ferreira. All cash. And the price stopped me cold, $310,000 for 4 acres of improved lake frontage that had appraised, 18 months earlier for insurance purposes, at $480,000. Even through the fog of hydrocodone, I understood the shape of that number. That wasn't a sale. That was a favor wearing a sales clothes. Kwan laid it out on the phone, careful and precise the way good lawyers are when they think they've found something. An all-cash purchase, significantly under appraised value, closing while the co-owner's daughter was in emergency surgery, arranged by a business associate of the person holding the power of attorney. On its own, that's a pattern that draws real scrutiny, even with a technically valid POA. Powers of attorney carry a fiduciary duty. Your father was legally required to act in your interest, not his partner's. This deal doesn't look like it meets that bar. Then he asked about the signature. Even with a valid power of attorney, the closing paperwork still required my father to sign explicitly as my attorney, in fact, a specific legal format, clearly marked. What the recorded document showed instead was a signature formatted to look like it was mine directly, with no attorney-in-fact designation anywhere on the page. Either my father had signed my name outright, or someone else had. That night, Priya and I put every signature of mine we could find in my Coast Guard ID, my flight physical forms, an old birthday card side by side with the signature on the deed. Mine has a fast, hard cross on the R. The one on the deed was slower, rounder, careful, someone tracing what they thought my signature looked like rather than someone who'd watched me sign 100 hoist logs. And then there was the notary block. The notary certified that Casey Reyes had personally appeared before her and signed the document. Kwan requested the notary's journal, which by law records the exact time each signer appears. It came back with a timestamp, 2:14 in the afternoon, the same day as my surgery. I did not need to guess where I was at 2:14 that afternoon. I needed it in writing, on hospital letterhead, down to the minute, and I knew exactly which department could give it to me. My sister Devon called the next morning, 29, the bride, her voice already pitched somewhere between apology and irritation. Casey, why is this becoming a whole thing right now? I let the silence stretch, because silence is the fastest way to get a nervous person talking. She filled it. She knew, vaguely, that the money situation had gotten complicated. She hadn't asked for details. She had a wedding to plan, a dress to fit, future in-laws with a name on shipping containers to impress, and she'd simply assumed it was handled. Handled. The family's favorite word for the things done to me without my knowledge. They sold my cabin, Devon, I said. Grandpa's cabin. While I was in surgery. A pause. Then, soft, in our mother's exact rehearsed cadence, it's just a cabin, Case. My own sister, reaching for the same tired line, passed down like a family recipe nobody questions the ingredients of. I closed my eyes and felt something in me go quiet and very clear. She hadn't forged a signature. She hadn't negotiated a lowball deal with her father's business partner. But she had chosen, very deliberately, not to ask, because asking might have cost her the wedding she wanted. Did you ever once ask whose property was paying for any of this? I said. No, she admitted. I didn't want to know. That was the whole thing, wasn't it? Nobody in my family had done this out of malice. They'd done it out of a kind of comfortable not looking, a quiet belief that Casey was a renewable resource who would regenerate whatever they took. I told her I loved her and hung up before she could hear my voice change. My Aunt Renata, my mother's younger sister, called an hour later, not to explain, but because she couldn't hold what she knew any longer. She'd overheard my father on the phone with Russ Ferreira 2 weeks before the surgery, arranging the paperwork for when Casey's under. Not after. Under. They had planned the timing around my anesthesia before I ever went into that water. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. It is one thing to discover your family took advantage of an unconscious moment. It is another thing entirely to learn the moment itself had been anticipated, scheduled around, like a weather window for a mission that was never supposed to be seen. I wanted to look Russ Ferreira in the eye, so Priya drove me to his office, a low brick building near the marina with his name stenciled on the glass. I walked in slow, ribs taped, cane in hand from the balance issues the injury had left me with. Russ stood up behind his desk and managed about 2 seconds of genuine discomfort before settling into the same reasonable man performance my father wears. "Casey. Good to see you up and around. You bought my cabin," I said. I didn't sit. Standing read better, and sitting hurt worse. "Your father had authority to sell," Russ said, spreading his hands. "Cash deal, clean, recorded. Nothing improper." "You bought $480,000 of lakefront for $310," I said, from a man whose daughter was under general anesthesia at the time. He didn't flinch, which told me everything. "Your dad and I go back 25 years, he said. He owed me. This squares us." Owed me. This squares us. There it was, the actual engine of the whole transaction. My grandfather's cabin hadn't paid for a wedding so much as it had quietly settled a debt my father owed his business partner, with a wedding venue deposit thrown in on top for cover and plausible deniability. Russ leaned back, comfortable now, and delivered the line he'd clearly rehearsed for this exact conversation. "I'd let this go if I were you. Good luck proving anything from a hospital bed." I looked at him for a long moment, then gave him the same calm, even smile I give a panicked survivor right before I tell them the part of the rescue plan they're not going to like. "I've pulled people out of water at 2 a.m. in a Category 2 storm," I said. "You'd be surprised what I can prove flat on my back." My complete surgical and ICU chart arrived a few days later, a thick envelope I read the way I read a search and rescue debrief, every entry, every timestamp, no skimming. Anesthesia induction confirmed at 11:40 in the morning. Vitals logged every 5 minutes straight through the afternoon by law and by habit, the way anesthesiologists document everything, because a chart is a legal record whether anyone ever expects it to be used as one. At 2:10 in the afternoon, my chart noted stable vitals, chest tube output recorded, surgical team mid-procedure repairing the third rib fracture. At 2:15, the same. At 2:14 in the afternoon, the exact minute a notary swore that Casey Reyes had personally appeared before her and signed a deed, I was under general anesthesia in an operating room, a tube down my throat, a surgical team working inside my chest. There is no version of that story where I was standing in a title company's office signing anything. I called Quan and read him the Times. I heard him get quietly excited in the careful way good lawyers allow themselves to. "That's about as strong an alibi as exists," he said. "It doesn't just support your case, it proves, beyond reasonable dispute, that you did not personally appear before that notary, no matter what her journal claims. Combined with the improperly formatted signature and the below-market cash sale to your father's own creditor, we don't just have a fiduciary breach argument anymore. We have grounds to argue the entire transaction was fraudulent, forged notarization, self-dealing, and a signature that was never yours." He laid out the plan the way I lay out a rescue plan, multiple moving pieces, sequenced correctly. First, a civil action to void the deed in quiet title, returning the cabin to my name. Second, a formal complaint to the state notary licensing board over a certification that the hospital record proved was physically impossible. Third, a referral to the district attorney's office, because a forged or improperly executed deed transferring real property isn't a family disagreement, it's fraud, and fraud is a matter for law enforcement, not for me to litigate alone at a dinner table. "Every one of these," Quan said, "you decide. You sign. I draft. But the moves are yours." That mattered to me more than he understood. Nobody was rescuing me here. I was running my own recovery operation. Then came the warning. Once we filed and recorded the notice of pending litigation, the sale would freeze publicly. Russ could not resell, could not refinance. And my family would know within days. I looked at a calendar with the rehearsal dinner circled in red. 12 days out. "Then let's move," I said. But on my timeline, not theirs. My father came to the rental alone a week later, no flowers, no performance this time. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, gray at the temples in a way that seemed to have happened all at once. He sat on the edge of the couch and put his face in his hands. "The marina expansion went under," he said, not looking up. "I'd borrowed against the business to get in on it with Russ, and when it collapsed, I owed him $160,000 I didn't have. And the Callaways, Grant's family, they've got real money, Casey. I couldn't stand the idea of them looking at us like we were nothing. I didn't know how else to not look like a failure. I believed him. That was the worst part. I believed every word, and it didn't change a single fact I now had documented in a folder 3 inches thick. Then he lifted his head and asked the only thing he'd actually come to ask. Drop it. Just until after the wedding. Let Devon have her day, and then we'll figure out the cabin. I swear. Even here, even broken, he was still asking me to pay, not to be repaid. You didn't borrow from me, Dad, I said, keeping my voice level. You didn't even take from me in the ordinary sense. You erased me. You put a stranger's signature format on my name and sold the one thing Grandpa ever specifically chose to give me, to settle a debt to the man who bought it. He stood up, and the softness in his face curdled into the thing it always becomes when men like him don't get their way. You're going to humiliate this entire family, he said at the door. No, I said quietly. I'm going to tell the truth in a room where it can't be reframed afterward. Those aren't the same thing. After he left, I did what I always do when my hands won't stop shaking, I organized. I built the cleanest folder of my life, 1 page at a time, because I had decided the rehearsal dinner would be where this ended, and I wanted the documents to do the talking, not my voice. 1 page, the appraisal showing the cabin's true value. 1 page, the deed, with its improperly formatted signature, beside my actual signature from a hoist log. 1 page, the notary's journal entry timestamped 2:14 p.m., beside my anesthesia record showing me under general anesthesia at that exact minute. 1 page, the wire transfer record showing Russ Ferreira's cash payment landing, within 9 days, as a payoff against my father's marina debt to that same Russ Ferreira. 1 page, a short letter from Kwan, in plain lawyer language, stating that the transaction showed clear indicators of self-dealing, fraudulent notarization, and a signature that did not match the record holder, grounds sufficient to void the deed and refer the matter for criminal investigation. I made 3 copies. I rehearsed no speech, because the documents were the speech. My mother had, weeks earlier, laid a soft green dress across my childhood bed with the same gentle instruction I'd get from her again days before the rehearsal dinner. Wear this, not your uniform, the Callaways are refined people, don't make the evening about you. I want to be honest about something. I almost listened. 3 broken ribs, on painkillers, exhausted from fighting a legal battle on top of physical recovery, the soft green dress and the quiet seat near the back would have been so much easier. For one long night, I sat with both the dress and my service dress blues laid out on the bed, and I let myself feel every reason to choose the easy path. Then I thought about my grandfather building that dock board by board with hands that had survived a war nobody thanked him properly for either. I thought about the 4th name I carry from that rescue mission, the one who didn't come home, whose family will never get a wedding for him to attend. I thought about 11 years of being the lifeguard thing at a table where everyone else's job got a toast. I packed the blues. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Callaway family's yacht club, the kind of place with a fireplace big enough to stand inside and portraits of men in double-breasted jackets going back 4 generations. My mother had mentioned the venue roughly 40 times in the preceding month, always in the same reverent tone, because the Callaways were exactly the audience my father had bankrupted a chunk of my inheritance to impress. I arrived in simple clothes, changed quietly in a side room, and walked out into a ballroom of 120 guests in my dress blues, the crest, the ribbons in their exact required order, the small silver Coast Guard medal I'd been awarded for the mission that put me in that hospital bed in the first place, pinned where regulation says it belongs. I had no plan beyond taking my seat quietly and letting the truth exist in the room without me having to narrate it. I was not there to make a scene. I was there to stop helping them hide me. I'd made it maybe 15 feet along the wall when I felt the room's attention shift, that half-step drop in noise a crowd makes when something doesn't match the pattern it expected. I kept my eyes forward. And near the head table, an older man in a navy blue dinner jacket, silver-haired, sitting very straight, set down his glass and slowly rose to his feet. I didn't know his name yet. I would learn later it was Rear Admiral, retired, Elliot Voss, a longtime friend of the Callaway family and, decades earlier, the commanding officer who had signed off on the very rescue swimmer program I'd graduated from. He had spent 31 years around people who jump out of helicopters into storms for a living, and he knew, from across a crowded room, exactly what a Coast Guard medal on a dress blue uniform meant. His voice, when it came, filled the entire ballroom without him raising it much at all. 4 words. Rescue swimmer in the room. And then he brought his hand up in a slow, precise salute. An admiral in a tuxedo, at a wedding rehearsal, honoring a woman he had never personally met, because the ribbon on her chest had told him everything he needed to know. I stood very still. I am trained to move fast into chaos, not to stand motionless inside sudden, total silence directed entirely at me. My eyes stung. I did not let them fall. I came to attention and returned the salute, clean, the way training makes automatic even when your hands are shaking underneath it. Then I heard a chair scrape. Then another. Then a third, near the bar. I counted them afterward, because I needed to. 11 people in that room, Navy officers, a retired Marine, a former merchant mariner who'd once been pulled out of the water himself decades earlier by a swimmer he never got the chance to thank, rose to their feet. Some saluted. Some simply stood at attention, eyes forward, the civilian version of I see you, and you are not alone in this room. 120 guests went silent as 11 people stood for a medal, for a mission, for a name I carry every single day that will never get a wedding of his own. My mother made a small broken sound somewhere to my left as the full weight of what she'd spent a decade hiding landed on her in front of the exact people she'd sold my grandfather's cabin to impress. It was Grant's father, Edmund Calloway, who moved first. He crossed the floor, took my hand in both of his, and said, loud enough for the room, Lieutenant Commander, we are honored to have you here. Then he told a story I hadn't known. His own father had served as a Navy corpsman, and the family had quietly funded a maritime rescue scholarship for 3 generations specifically because of what that service had cost and given his family. The refined people my mother had been so terrified would judge a uniform were, it turned out, the people in that room most likely to understand exactly what it meant. My mother tried to reframe it, stepping forward with both hands out, voice pitched too high, too fast. We are so proud of her. We've always been so proud of our Casey. But her composure cracked the second she saw I wasn't going to smile and let her rewrite 11 years in 11 seconds. I didn't raise my voice. You spent this whole engagement afraid I'd embarrass you, I said, quiet enough that the room had to lean in, which made it carry further than any shout could have. You sold the one thing Grandpa specifically left to me while I was under anesthesia, to pay off Dad's debt to the man you sold it to, and you called it just a cabin. These people just stood for the exact thing you were ashamed of. She had no answer. My father had gone gray near the bar. My sister stood frozen at the head table with her hand over her mouth. I turned from my mother, because she was not who I wanted my next words to be for. I looked at Admiral Voss and the 10 others still standing, dropped my salute, and gave them a small nod. Then, briefly, because a rescue swimmer doesn't turn a debrief into a speech, I told the room the only thing that actually mattered. There were 4 people in the water that night, I said. I brought 3 of them home. This medal isn't only mine. I carry it for the 4th. I stand here because he doesn't get to. I placed the folder appraisal, forged signature comparison, notary timestamp beside my anesthesia record, wire transfer showing the payoff to Russ Ferreira gently on the table in front of my parents. This is for you, so there's no confusion later about what was actually said here tonight. Then I picked up my cane, because the ribs and the balance issues hadn't gone anywhere just because the room had, and I walked out slow and straight, on my own 2 feet, the way I'd promised myself I would. The law moved faster than Quan had predicted, because a forged notarization certified against an anesthesia record leaves very little room for argument. Faced with the wire transfer showing his cash landing directly against my father's debt within 9 days of closing, Russ Ferreira's attorney told him to stop defending a deal he could not win. He agreed to a consent judgment. The court voided the deed. Title to the cabin returned to my name, or it had never legitimately stopped being. The notary's certification, once the state licensing board reviewed the hospital timeline, was referred for its own investigation. A signer physically incapable of appearing where and when the journal claimed is not a clerical error, it's a false certification. The district attorney's office opened a file on the transaction itself. My father did not go to prison. The plea agreement his attorney negotiated involved restitution and probation, the slow, unglamorous kind of consequence that doesn't make for a dramatic scene but follows a person for a long time. The wedding happened, eventually, though smaller and later than planned, and paid for honestly. Devon and I are rebuilding something slower and more careful than what we had. She comes up to the cabin now sometimes, and she has never once called it just a building since that night. My mother and I speak rarely. I didn't cut her off with a declaration. I simply stopped being the account she could draw from without asking. My father's case moves through the system at its own gray pace, and every few months he sends a letter, handwritten, that I read and don't always answer, because forgiveness and readiness are not the same clock. I went back to the helicopter as soon as flight surgeons cleared me. The next time I stood at the door of that aircraft looking down at black water, I thought about how carefully every second of a rescue gets logged, timestamped, documented by people who have no idea that record might someday be the only thing standing between a person and having her whole life quietly signed away. A system built to save lives at sea ended up saving mine on land, in a courtroom, in a way nobody in that operating room could have guessed. Here's what I know now, and it took nearly drowning and then nearly losing my grandfather's cabin in the same month to learn it. Love that only ever flows one direction while calling itself family isn't love. It's a lien. And I stopped paying interest on it the day I understood that my name, even copied badly by someone else's hand, still belonged only to me. That's how a quiet woman takes her name back. 1 collapsed lung. 61 missed calls. 11 strangers standing up for a medal that was never really about a wedding at all. If this story reached something in you, tell me in the comments about the moment you finally stopped letting people call the thing they took from you just something. And subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge, where the ones everyone underestimated are always the ones who get the last word.